So great that a lot of the Israelites are afraid of the Philistines. And as we talked about last week, we began in verse 1. We began in verse 1 looking at how it was really probably in the second year of Saul's reign when these events have occurred. Jonathan had smote the garrison of the Philistines, whether that was the actual army or could refer to the leader of the armies of the Philistines. This provoked the Philistines to war with the Israelites. And the Israelites are in preparation of gearing for war. And as verse 5 indicates, they are very much outnumbering the Israelites. They've got chariots, they've got horsemen, and as the Bible just simply states in verse 5, that you have that the armies of the Philistines, the number of them is as the sand which is on the seashore, right? So it's innumerable to a certain extent. And the Israelites are obviously afraid of this. They go to Saul. And as we talked about last week, the Philistines at this point are situated in the city, or in the region, or the city of Michmash, which is apparently where the Israelites had fled from that city once the Philistines approached. And as we talked about, again, Saul makes an offering in part to get God's favor with what's about to happen. And as we know, that even though Saul had the best of intentions, he had what he thought to be justifiable reasons for offering a sacrifice. Saul had no place doing this because he was not a priest. He was simply just the king. And Samuel rebukes him for it. And so where we pick up tonight is that Saul is really in a tough position, not just physically, but we might also say mentally as well. In the sense of Saul's about to face a physical challenge, but what has just recently been put on his mind is something that would affect anybody, possibly emotionally, because Saul has learned that he will not, his kingdom, he will not be able to pass it on down to his sons. As we talked about last week, you can think about how hard it would be for you to work your entire life for something, to build everything up, and to position yourself where you could pass it off to your children or grandchildren, and then all of a sudden that ability being taken away from you because you made a bad decision. That's essentially what has happened with Saul. But we see in chapter 13, though, after this has happened, that essentially Saul doesn't really have much time to worry about it because the Philistines are still on the threshold of attacking the Israelites. Verses 16 through 18, sort of the first section we'll look at, really the end of this section, verses 16 through 23 to the end of the chapter, talks about the Philistine, what we might call the Philistine raiders that are coming and threatening the Israelites. Verses 16 through 18 sort of introduces us to these soldiers that have come to try to intimidate the Israelites. So we pick up verse 16, that Saul and Jonathan his son and the people that were present with them abode in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. And so we're told that the city of Michmash and Gibeah, or Geba, is somewhere in the neighborhood about 4 miles apart. That becomes a little bit more important when we move forward in the text. But again, you think about where you're at with Saul. If you put yourself in Saul's shoes, Saul has just learned that he will not have the kingdom. He won't be able to pass that down to his son. But now he's having to face the army of the Philistines, who numerically are much greater than the Israelites. And if you think about it in that situation, you know, how much resolve, if we haven't read this yet, how much resolve will Saul have? How much effort is he willing to put into everything to try to help the Israelites be victorious, despite having this unfortunate knowledge for Saul to be placed on his shoulders? How much effort could he put in with that? If you put yourself in that situation, how much of your mindset could you gear towards getting the Israelites prepared for war, despite learning one of the toughest things that a king would ever have to hear, that he couldn't pass his kingdom down to his son? Now I think about that, and I think about that for us as well, maybe a point of comparison, point of application. We know that everyone will not be saved, which is very unfortunate, because we become Christians not just for the spiritual sake of ourselves, but for the spiritual sake of others that we come into contact with. And knowing that not everyone's going to be saved, that can hurt our resolve in terms of talking to them about the Bible. It can hurt our resolve in terms of living the type of example that would motivate somebody to become a Christian. And so, knowing that knowledge, sometimes we might not want to put the 100% of our effort into that because not everyone's going to be saved. But what's required of us, again, for God is 100% effort. Tough to do in a position like that, but then again, we think about our job in terms of teaching others, it can be a tough challenge as well. We note again that only 600 men were with Saul at the time. So the Philistines, who apparently have recognized this, they're going to press forward because they have a much greater army to fight against the Israelites. And this is actually one of several different physical advantages that the Philistines have in terms of fighting a battle with the Israelites. But the important thing as we move forward is going to be that God fights on the side of the Israelites. Something that obviously outweighs any physical advantages that the Philistines had. Now you note in verse 17, it says that the spoilers came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned unto the way that leadeth to Ophrah, unto the land of Shual, and another company turned the way to Beth Oren, and another company turned to the way of the border that looketh to the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. So it might be difficult for us to think about it just reading the text, but what's being illustrated here is that within the Philistine army, 3 different groups of soldiers essentially have been assigned to go take the land that surrounds where the Israelites are at in the city of Gibeah. And you've got the word there for spoilers. If you've got another translation, Abby, I think you've got another translation. What do you have for the word spoilers?
Sorry. Raiding parties?
Yeah, so the idea of raiding party. The word here is actually, the root of it means to destroy. And what's interesting, the same word that's used here for spoilers is used to denote the destroyer in Exodus chapter 12, verse 23. Do we recall what was going on in Exodus chapter 12 with the being known as the destroyer? Yeah, that was the death of the firstborn. Exodus chapter 12, the final plague, the death of the firstborn, the angel of death was called the destroyer. And you know how great devastation that the angel of death at that point had because of how many of the firstborn of the Egyptians had died. Same idea here in the sense of how much damage these soldiers, these 3 companies are doing to the land surrounding Gibeah, where the Israelites are at. And what again is indicated here is that they're not just taking the land for themselves, but they're trying to make it useless for the Israelites. That's one of the things about generally in wartime and in antiquity. Generally, they surrounded a city, they destroyed the land around it. You sort of choke out the people because you have the ability to do that. Maybe the same idea what's going on here. The idea here is that they pose a very great threat to the Israelites, and they're destroying the land that is around them. Right? So that's one physical advantage the Philistines are going to have over them. Right? The natural resources in that area around Gibeah, the Israelites will not have because of what the Philistines are doing in verses 17 and 18. But here's another physical advantage for the Philistines. Verse 19. The Bible says, "Now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears." So one of the things that we note about the Philistines that's given to us, at least in secular history, is that the Philistines were known for their ability to produce iron tools and iron weapons. It's been said that they were probably the greatest at being able to do that in the land of Palestine at the time. If you recall, we talked about the Philistines. One of the places of origin that they came from was that they migrated off the coast of Greece. And in the kingdom there that existed in Greece at the time, the kingdom of Pylos, it was said that the capital city was home to one of the largest iron industries at the time. And so what's given here is that the Philistines have an advantage in terms of the military technology that they use, in terms of the weapons that they're using. Israel, though, has the disadvantage. Again, there's no iron workers or smiths found throughout the land. And so, as verse 19 indicates, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. So they don't have iron weapons. We might think about this in terms of going to battle against the Philistines, that the Israelites are bringing a knife to a gunfight. They are very much without the proper military equipment. And the Philistines, at least in one sense, are wise, right? Because you don't want the Israelites to revolt against you. Don't give them very good weapons to do that. It could have been as well that, we talked about earlier on, and we'll talk about next week, that there were some Israelites that apparently had joined the ranks of the Philistines. It could have been that the Philistines had taken away some of these iron workers that had originally been in the land. In 2 Kings chapter 24, when the Israelites are going into Babylonian captivity, it notes that one of the groups of people that was taken out of the land were the iron workers, the blacksmiths. And it was not necessarily because they had a lot of wealth per se, but the idea is that if you took away the iron workers, the Israelites have no way to produce weapons. Right? So you limit their ability to fight. It's what the Philistines had done. And so, in one way, again, this just helps us remind us of why the Philistines continue to pose an advantage over the Israelites. Because we've talked about on several occasions how the Israelites had beaten the Philistines, but yet it seems over and over again how the Philistines continue to pose a threat. Well, we know that comes from the Israelites' disobedience, but it also could tie in with the fact that in terms of the military technology, the Philistines just had better weapons to fight with. You think about in other moments in Israel's history dealing with the Philistines, it's interesting to point this out. Samson does not use iron tools to defeat the Philistines. You don't see it mentioned there. We know that in 1 Samuel there have been at least 2 other occasions where the Israelites and the Philistines have fought each other. In both of those occasions, we don't see them being able to use iron tools as well. And both of those battles ended in defeat. So the same situation here. The Israelites don't have these metal tools, but yet the Israelites didn't need these metal tools to win because they had God on their side. And it's interesting to note this situation and then look at what is said in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 47, after David had defeated the Philistine Goliath. This is part of a larger way in which David was talking about how he would defeat the Philistine Goliath. And he said in verse 47, "All this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Again, all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. See, David acknowledged that, we might not have the best weaponry involved, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to be victorious against God's enemy, because God's on our side. Likewise, and this account with Jonathan in chapter 14 in some ways is very similar to what goes on with David and Goliath in chapter 17. Jonathan's going to really have the same mindset as we'll see in verse 6 of chapter 14. So David, again, sort of is acknowledging that the Israelites don't have the best military advantage, but they can still be victorious, which is a very interesting thing to point out. Sometimes I thought about this too, trying to think of application that's connected with that. I think sometimes we may worry about, are we adequate enough to be able to, I'll say it like this, be able to compete with other people. And I was thinking about this example. I'm sure all of you in here know I was in graduate school at Mississippi State. And I remember talking to people, because graduate school is pretty stressful. Any type of level of education can be pretty stressful. I know graduate school for me was very stressful. And I remember listening to conversations about how other graduate students handled their stress. And a lot of times, sometimes they talked about how, on the weekends they would drink and get drunk. And what it did was it sort of loosened their mind to where you're not always thinking about, what you've got going on, your education and things like that. And I thought to myself that, it would be really great if I had that same advantage, that I could do the same thing as them to sort of unwind and to not have to, to have that opportunity to take that stress off by essentially getting drunk. I thought about it like that, but obviously I recognized that was not an acceptable option for me, and I could have thought to myself at the time, that they've got a better means of overcoming this task of getting through graduate school than I do, because they have that option available. But then, I sat back and I thought about, the role that Christianity plays in my life, right? People would look at getting up and going to church on Sunday as something that takes away from time. But in part, I thought about it not just in the sense of worshiping God, but all the encouragement, the mental fortitude, just not just restoring the zeal as a Christian, but restoring the zeal in terms of having a great work ethic that I felt renewed by being with other Christians and things like that. And I recognized that I had something much better than having to rely on what other people use to get their minds stress-free, so to speak. That's just an example that came to my mind, but hopefully you can kind of see the same point. Sometimes we complain that we can't do things that other people can do as Christians, but in reality, we've got a lot better alternatives. Just like in this passage, Jonathan had a whole lot better alternative than having to rely on the metal weapons that the Philistines had. They had the ability to rely on God, which was much more powerful. But again, verse 20 indicates to us the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen every man his share in his coulter and his axe and his mattock. Verse 21, yet they had a file for the mattocks and for the coulters and for the forks and for the axes to sharpen the goads. So verse 20 indicates to us that while the Israelites don't have the weapons, they do have what looks to be metal farming tools. Right? So in part it shows that the Israelites still depended on the Philistines to have these items. And so verse 21, it says, yet they had a file for the mattocks. Abby, what does your translation say, verse 21?
It says mattocks. It says files and mattocks.
What does it say for, does it have another word for file? F-I-L-E? How does verse 21 begin?
The price was 2/3 of a shekel.
Right. Yeah, so the idea here is that the Israelites, they had to rely on the Philistines for their iron goods, but in order to sharpen those iron goods, they had to go to the Philistines and pay them to sharpen their essentially farming instruments. So the Philistines had that advantage in terms of limiting the weapons, but now the Israelites had to go pay the Philistines just to sharpen their own iron farming tools. So that's another advantage that the Philistines had. The Israelites are essentially economically dependent on them. And so, again, the Israelites are in a pretty tough position here. So, verse 22, the day of battle. It says, so it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan, but with Saul and with Jonathan his son was there found. Again, just the idea here that only Saul and Jonathan had iron weapons. The rest of the Israelites didn't have that. Verse 23, the garrison of the Philistines went out to the passage of Michmash. So again, we've been told why the Israelites do not have any iron tools, and the emphasis in chapter 14 is that they didn't need them because God's going to deliver them the victory. The other three divisions have moved out to the countryside. They are taking that land. And so the main portion of the Philistine army in verse 23 has moved forward to attack the Israelites in Gibeah. And we're told that Michmash and Gibeah are situated on hills apart from one another. And you have a valley in between the two. And so what is indicated is that the Philistines have come off the hill of Michmash. They're now in the valley going towards the hill where Geba's at to attack the Israelites. And that's, if we had to get in our mind what it looked like, that's sort of how it looked like. They're on two hills. They're up top on two hills. The Philistines who are on Michmash, they've come down to the valley to come and attack the Israelites who are at Geba. And this is explaining the event that's coming in chapter 14, how Jonathan's actually going to be Jonathan, along with the help of God, obviously, is going to help deliver the Israelites. With that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to the end of chapter 13, based on what we've talked about?
You know, you made the point that knowing not everybody's going to be saved might lessen our enthusiasm to try to save them. And, well, you see the same principle in what you do and what Tanya does is you try to teach. You would like to think that every student is going to be on fire and zealous to soak up, what you're teaching. But reality is, so many either don't care or don't put forth the effort and so forth. But again, the job is, or the responsibility is, you do your part, and then if somebody doesn't want to learn, that's their fault. And so we try to save souls, and full well knowing that many don't listen, but at the same time, we've done our part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good thought. You think about in this context, Jonathan's obviously going to be the more active one. You think about Jonathan. Jonathan also has knowledge that, the kingdom that his father has, there's nothing really that Jonathan can do to actually get the kingdom back. And so if you're in Jonathan's position, you'd think to yourself, why should I be out here fighting when I know that the kingdom's not going to be mine? But yeah, chapter 14, Jonathan is really leading the attack against the Philistines, which speaks very well about Jonathan. Chapter 14, now it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan the son of Saul said unto the young man that bare his armor, Come and let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he told not his father. So verse 1 sort of opens up with an initial statement that is explaining what is going on the side of the Israelites while the Philistines have moved out into the valley. And what is given to us really is a contrast between Saul and Jonathan. Saul, back in verse 16 of chapter 13 and verse 15 of chapter 13, really had been concerned with about the number of men that the Israelites had and really how they were overwhelmed in that sense. But Jonathan, again, is only really going to be focused on how many, on whether or not God is on the side of the Israelites, which again speaks very well of Jonathan. And it is interesting to note that, again, chapter 13 talked about Saul's failure in terms of offering a sacrifice when he should not have, and chapter 15, when Saul fails to completely wipe out the Amalekites, that in the middle of those two accounts, you've got this account of Jonathan who does the right thing. And that's very interesting to note. So Jonathan decides in verse 1 that they are going to launch a surprise attack. Him and his armor bearer. Jonathan and his armor bearer. And it seems that, like, at least at first, this doesn't seem like good strategy at all. Right? The idea of going and attacking without telling the army that you're going to attack. Saul, was one of the leading generals because he's king. But yet Jonathan doesn't inform the king of what his decision is. And it's not like Jonathan and the armor bearer are going to go out and scout the enemy. Sometimes you would do that. You'd send a man or a couple of men out to, scout the enemy, see what numbers they have, where they're located, and things like that. That's not what Jonathan's going to do here. Jonathan has witnessed, again, verse 23, seen what the Philistines have done, and Jonathan's going to respond accordingly to his faith. So this is what Jonathan does. Verses 2 and 3, we are given what Saul is doing at the same time. It says that Saul tarried in the uttermost part of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron, and the people that were with him were about 600 men. And Ahiah the son of Ahiatub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, wearing an ephod, and the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. So Saul, it says in verse 2 that he tarried in the uttermost part of Gibeah. And the indication there from the uttermost part is the idea that he is within Gibeah, he is in the position where he is furthermost or farthest away from where the Philistines are at Michmash. So if we think about it for us, if the Philistines were in Verona and we are in Tupelo, Philistines are in Verona. If we were like Saul, we would be up there at Barnes Crossing, right? We'd be farthest point away from them. That's what's indicated here. Saul is trying to put distance between himself and the Philistine soldiers who have come from Michmash. And as verse 3 indicates, it says that he has a man named Ahiah, or as some translations may have, Ahijah by his side. Now you know who is Ahijah related to that we've already talked about in 1 Samuel. Yeah, he's actually the great-grandson of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. It says that he's wearing an ephod, and we've talked about this before, but on the ephod, it was a garment that the priest would wear, but you had a compartment inside which had the two stones, the Urim and the Thummim, and this was one way in which the people of Israel could communicate with God. I believe it's 1 Samuel chapter 23. David puts on the ephod and communicates with God. And the idea is simply that in the process of figuring out what they're going to do, Saul wanted to make sure that they had a spokesman for God be by his side in order to get God's advice on the matter. Now, it is interesting to think about, why is it Ahijah and not Samuel? And at least at this point in 1 Samuel, we don't know exactly why, but we keep in mind that Samuel was the one who told him that, his kingdom would not belong to him later on. You almost wonder if, it says that Samuel left, you almost wondered if Saul kind of wanted him to leave after hearing that news. And maybe that's why he has Ahijah with him, verse 3. But again, they do not know that Jonathan has gone. And just one other comment about verse 3. A lot of times in the Old Testament, and even in cultures, even in other cultures besides the Jews, it was often thought of to consult. For the Jews, it's thought to consult God. For the other religious groups, it was often thought that they needed to consult their gods whenever they wanted to make an important military decision. And again, that's just what's reflective of going on here. But we might make the point again that, we can consult God, we can request God's help, we can put everything on God, but at the same time, we have a responsibility to do our part. And that is what's different here, I think, between Saul and Jonathan. Right? Saul, because he has Ahijah there, he's willing to put a lot of this share on God, but yet Saul's not the one who acts in this chapter, at least early on. It's going to be Jonathan. And we already talked about how Jonathan, or we're going to see verse 6, Jonathan has faith that God can deliver them. But Jonathan acts on that faith, and that's what's very important. Because verse 4 and 5, again, people don't know that Jonathan has been gone. Verse 4, and between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over unto the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on the one side, and a sharp rock on the other side. And the name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other Seneh. The forefront of the one was situated north over against Michmash, and the other southward over against Gibeah. And reading this, it was I had to read through this a few times to try to figure out what was really going on here, what's being explained. But what the idea here is that Jonathan is going out to meet the Philistines, and he essentially finds a strategic place in which to scout the enemy out and eventually to launch an attack. It says that he went over to the Philistines' garrison. There was a sharp rock on the one side and a sharp rock on the other side. So the idea here is that you've got two rocks that are sort of overlooking a narrow passageway. And I guess the closest thing that I could think of to illustrating this, if you've ever seen a Western movie, you probably have seen this scene played out several times where you see a group of cowboys go into a narrow passageway, and then all of a sudden you hear a gunshot and people are shooting from up top on either side of the on either side of the passageway. because, the people that are up top obviously have it's easier to shoot down than shoot up, right? And so you think about it in that sense, like an ambush in a Western movie, sort of like that. This is sort of the same idea, right? The Philistines, there's this part where they settle that there's a narrow passageway, and there are two rocks that sort of overlook that passageway. And Jonathan looks at it and sees this as a great place to scout out the Philistines and to look at them. Perfect, as what one writer put, it was a perfect opportunity for just a few men to be able to fight a lot of men. And it's, again, important to note that Jonathan's courage, his willingness to act on his faith, puts him in a position where he finds this place. Because, again, if Jonathan had just said that, he's just going to wait this out, he never finds a strategic place, but he acts on his faith. I'll go ahead and pause there. Are there any comments that you'd like to add on to verses 1 through 5 of chapter 14?
James also talks about the importance of acting on faith. James 2, faith works is dead. So, like I say, Jonathan acted on his.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan acted on his faith. Saul, of course, did struggle a lot with his faith because chapter 13, he acted, but he didn't act appropriately. But again, verse 6, again, Jonathan's not just doing this because he's ambitious per se. I mean, he is courageous in that sense. But verse 6, Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, "Come and let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised, that it may be that the Lord will work for us. For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few." It could have been that the armor bearer had hesitated in verse 1 when Jonathan first gave this request, which led to Jonathan repeating the same thing in verse 6. But we don't necessarily know that for sure. But you note in verse 6 that that Jonathan's very clear that it may be the Lord will work for us. Now, we might think about this statement in the sense that Jonathan is sort of saying that, maybe God will work this out. Or, if we say that it may be that the Lord will work for us, what could come into mind is the question of whether or not God would be able to intervene. But that's not what Jonathan's suggesting here. What he's really just suggesting is that God has the ability to operate, but that God doesn't always have to do what man wants to operate. Right? We cannot do anything to motivate God to act, right? We understand that. Just like we as Christians cannot do anything to merit God extending His grace and mercy to us, right? There's nothing that we can do for that. Likewise, Jonathan recognizes that even though he's devised this plan, Jonathan's decision does not mean that God has to grant him the victory. Jonathan does acknowledge again that God can do it, but not that God has to do it. Fortunately for Jonathan, God again does reward Jonathan's faith by what happens in the next few verses. Again, you think about that last phrase in verse 6, "For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few." You can't help but think about in the book of Judges chapter 7, the example of Gideon, right? Gideon had assembled an army, and I believe at least 2 or 3 occasions God told him to whittle down the army. He didn't need that many soldiers. And what happens was that the few soldiers that Gideon had remaining, they were able to defeat, I believe it was the Moabites in that story, who were far superior to them. You think about Jonathan might have thought about that occasion when he's thinking about the Israelites' position battling these Philistines that are very much outnumbered them. Verse 6 again, what's noted about the Philistines, is again, he calls them the uncircumcised. And we might not recognize this right off the bat, but there were other people besides the Jews who were circumcised. Right? You think about the Edomites, and who did they descend from? They descended from Esau. If you keep in mind, the covenant of circumcision had been granted to Abraham, who was Esau's grandfather, right? So Esau knew about the covenant of circumcision. The Edomites, they knew about the covenant of circumcision. So the Edomites were people that practiced it. What's being indicated here with again, the uncircumcised, this is used a lot to refer to the Philistines. David would refer to Goliath in this way. And what it probably again indicates is that the Philistines were not native to the land of Palestine. Probably why that's used so frequently with them. And I thought that might be interesting to note. But verse 7, the armor bearer this time specifically notes he has confidence in Jonathan. His armor bearer said unto him, do all that is in thine heart. Turn thee, behold, I am with thee according to thy heart. So essentially the armor bearer just says, Jonathan, lead on. Lead the way. I have confidence in what you're going to do. So we're going to try to get through verse 15 rather quickly here. We can come back to this next week if we need to. All right, so Jonathan devises this plan beginning in verse 8. Jonathan said, behold, we will pass over unto these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. If they say thus unto us, tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and will not go up unto them. But if they say thus, come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us. So really, Jonathan's plan is dependent on how the Philistines interact here. The plan is that Jonathan and the armor bearer, they go and they reveal themselves. And if the Philistines say that they need to stay where they're at and the Philistines are going to come to them, that means that this is not favorable to their advantage. But if the Philistines say that they should come down unto them, again, that just indicated that God would be on their side. The idea here. So verse 11, both of them discovered themselves, or they revealed themselves unto the garrison of the Philistines. The Philistines said, behold, the Hebrews come forth out of the holes where they had hid themselves. And the men of the garrison answered Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us, and we will show you a thing. And Jonathan said unto his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord hath delivered them in the hand of Israel. You stop right here and you think about, again, we talk about Jonathan's faith. You got to have a lot. The armor bearer of Jonathan had to have a lot of faith as well, right? Because you're talking about two individuals that are going to approach an army that had hundreds and maybe even thousands at this point after those divisions had left. And I don't know about you, but me and another person, I wouldn't, and my enemy was right down the valley, I wouldn't just walk up to the enemy's camp and say, here I am, right? That doesn't seem very logical to do. But the armor bearer acts on that, and it shows that the armor bearer's faith really in this passage needs to be commended as well. So verse 13, Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer slew after him. And that first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men, within, as it were, a half acre of land, which a yoke of oxen might plow. And there was trembling in the host, in the field, and among all the people, the garrison and the spoilers, they also trembled, and the earth quaked, so it was a very great trembling. So Jonathan and his armor bearer, they are very successful in their attack. Again, we keep in mind that what Jonathan has seen is a very narrow pass, and the idea is that within this attack, it would be easy for a few people to be able to tackle a lot. Because we keep in mind that the Philistines wanted Jonathan and the armor bearer to come down. They were not going to leave that position that they were at, which Jonathan had saw was advantageous to him and his armor bearer. So because the Philistines would not leave that spot, that left them open for an attack. And because of, again, Jonathan's discovery of this location, this great strategy, two men are able to effectively kill a lot of different soldiers because they're in such a narrow place. And you keep in mind that a lot of the weapons that the Israelites used were, if they weren't iron weapons, they were going to be arrows and bows and slings. So, again, great advantage here for the Israelites. And Jonathan and his armor bearer, that they are very successful. Again, verse 15, the earth quaked, so it was a very great trembling. Again, the idea is that God was with them and that they're very successful. And we'll go ahead and stop here, but where we pick up next week is what Saul's reaction to all of this will be. Because it's not going to be until after Jonathan has acted that, Saul decides to act. But again, we'll pick up in verse 16. Are there any other comments that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about thus far in 1 Samuel chapter 14? If not, we'll go ahead and stop here. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention this evening.